Many of you have asked for my Twitter handle. It's here on the screen. It's @FozanK. So we'll be doing more sessions on the Windows Phone next month, especially talking about connecting to the cloud, accessing services, backend data, and especially developing applications that can support various platforms. Like, for example, you want to develop on the iPhone, the Android, the Windows 8, Windows Phone. So how do you manage having one business layer that can talk to the different devices? And that's what we are going to talk about next month. In this session, we are going to talk about Windows Phone application design. And we're going to talk about how to design your applications using XAML, how to style it, how to use the inbuilt themes that are provided by the tool, how to data bind your application to the backend data. So the Windows Phone design style. We started this with the 7.0, what we call the Microsoft UI design principles. And these principles are inherently based on the metropolitan hoarding or board signature, which you see in most of the metropolitan cities, in airports, train stations, which uses clear typography to indicate the content. So for example, you go to an airport, like let's say China or Russia, where you do not understand the language, but yet looking at the boards, you can infer what the content is. Like, for example, departures, customs, boarding. So the intent of the Microsoft UI design principles is to come up with a design principle which is easy to understand, clear in representation, and very easy on the user in terms of the eye. So if you see here, we do not have Chrome, we do not have navigation bars, content is separated by empty space. You have a standard typography that you use across the phone and the Windows 8 ecosystem. So there are certain principles that make up this design paradigm, and most important of it is pride and craftsmanship. What does that mean? It means that when you set out to design your application, right, think carefully, design it well, and have pride in what you create. Like, for example, if I start to design an application, I'm not a designer, right? The output would probably not be very good. So I could leverage the skills of a friend, a professional designer, to come up with a better design that represents my application, right? So I have the ideas, I have the thoughts, but probably I need some help in, putting that into the design. Make the design such that it's easy for the user to use, right? Be fast and fluid, and this is one of the most important principles of both Windows Phone and Windows 8. The applications should at no point of time compromise the whole phone ecosystem. Like, for example, if your application does not start up in 15 seconds, this is going to kill your application, right? Because studies have shown that users usually do not wait that long for content. If you go to a website, if the page does not load in 10 seconds, people move on. They close the browser and they move on, right? So your content, your application needs to be fast. It needs to be fluid. It has to be always responsive to the user's interactions, right? And that is why if you see now with the Windows 8 and Windows Phone 8, we have the asynchronous programming model that is in place. So most of the APIs are asynchronous. The UI thread should not be blocked. Do more with less. So full content should be represented to the user. We do not bring in Chrome. We have a design which allows you to use empty spacing, the various colored boxes to design your application, represent content upfront to the user. Authentically digital. What does that mean? Do not try to be what you are not, right? So try to use the designs, and we'll talk about the typography and the rest of the designs in a while, but use the native styles that are there in Windows Phone 8 to develop your applications. So think about trying to develop a notepad application, and I try to put in, lines, and it moves away from the design principles of the Windows Phone ecosystem. So your application is not a notepad; it's a note-taking application. So bring in the content, but don't try to imitate what you are not. So use the typography, use the vibrant colors, use the animations that are there in the libraries to bring a very nice experience to the end user. Win as one. So use the ecosystem of the phone to leverage the capabilities of the phone ecosystem to build your applications. So for example, connecting to different applications, connecting to the built-in APIs that are there for the phone, utilizing those when you are building your application will give a very nice integrated kind of experience to your application. Okay? And the tools and the templates that we have in Visual Studio provide the starting points to get your application going. So these are, in a summary, the design principles. And when we talk about these in more detail in the following slides, it will become more clear to you. So if you look at the applications that are there, right? You have full content, no Chrome, you have no navigation bars, no scroll bars, no menu bars, right? Content is all based on clear typography. If you look at the design, they all have a consistent kind of interface in the application, and you're going to see these across the different applications that Microsoft builds. So you have that in Windows 8, you have it on Windows Phone. Even if you look at Outlook.com, right, it has a similar kind of look and feel. So you have consistency across all the platform. It's easy to read, it's easy to navigate, it's pleasant to the eye. We have the whole design document on the Windows Dev Center. I suggest anybody who's interested in building for the Windows platform, read this document. It's an important document, gives you an idea of what the design principles are, how you should best leverage the capabilities of the phone to build applications. So how do you design an application? If I am a developer, the first thing I will do is open up Visual Studio and start writing code, right? Yes or no? No? That's what we do. That's what we are. We are developers, right? We do not think in terms of design, but that's where you should start. Even before you touch the tools, think about your application, how it's going to look, how it's going to behave, what is the navigation pattern that you're going to put. Do it on paper, right? Think the overall ecosystem of your application, how it's going to be. So we're going to develop an application called the Contours of Cookbook as we go along in these slides. And what I want is, I want to have the recipes from the different regions of the world. So I want to have Chinese, I want to have Italian, I want to have French. So the way I would do that is I would have probably a list box which indicates the different regions that I want to have the recipes for. When the user clicks on any one of those regions, then I'm going to take him to something called the pivot table, and we'll talk about this in a while. The pivot table is like a scrollable region where you can bring in different pages. So I could have, for example, the front page could talk about the region itself, right? And what the recipes from those regions are like. Then I could have a list for the recipes itself, and I could have, if I select any one recipe, then I can take him to the next page, which gives him the ingredients and the steps to cook that recipe. So the starting point should be your pen and pencil. You should start thinking about in designing the application, right? The next should be navigation. And we'll talk about this in more detail when you do the next session, and we talk about why navigation is important. Because users expect a certain behavior, right? And if that behavior is broken, then your application becomes confusing, and people probably do not want to use that application then. So in here we have the regions. We go from the regions to the regional recipes. From the regional recipe, I go back to the page for the recipe and the details and the steps of those recipes. And then I could have another page which talks about the notes and the photos for that recipe. And then if I go back, I can come to the main page. When I click back from the main page, then I'm taken back to my start screen. Right? I could also have an about back, which then takes me back to the home page. If you see here on the Windows Phone, we have a hardware back button, which the users will use to navigate back to your application. And that's something that you need to tie into, right? Because the users, when they press the back button on the home page of your application, they expect to go back to the start screen. Now start with the building tools, and we provide you with the starting templates. Visual Studio, when you download the Windows Phone SDK, it comes with two tools, not one. It comes with Visual Studio 2012 Express, and it comes with Blend for Visual Studio. Right? One is targeted towards developers, Visual Studio. The other one is for designers. And you have both of these at no cost. They provide all the capabilities that you need to build and design your applications. We have higher SKUs which provide you more capabilities in terms of testing, enterprise capabilities like source safe, source control, etc. But as a developer, as a designer, the tools that you get with the SDK are capable of designing and developing nice applications. So this is the layout for the Blend. Right, and we will take a look of that of Blend when we do some demos. In terms of code creation, we have Visual Studio. What we have also done is taken some of the capabilities that existed in Blend and brought them to Visual Studio. So some of the properties that were there in, or the properties window that was there in Blend, the document outline, some of the wizards that were there in Blend, just to ensure that the developers also have a good experience and do not have to go between Visual Studio and Blend very often. In terms of the look and feel of your application, we provide templates, and we saw some of the templates in the morning. We'll look at more of these as we go along. So we provide you out-of-the-box templates. So we have the pivot control application, we have the panorama style application, we have a data-bound application, which gives you the starting point to build application and customize those applications as you go along. One more thing I want to mention here is you have the separation of content. So you have the design, which is XAML, and then you have the code behind. And you can have two teams working on it simultaneously. So you can have the designers working on the UI in XAML, and then you have the developers working on the code behind and the application logic on a separate team. And then both of them tie together very well. So as I mentioned, we have the templates out of the box. We have the phone app, which is a starting page. We have the data-bound application. We have the panorama style application, the pivot tab application. And we'll see these. So these are some of the templates that are out of the box. Each has its own capability. So for example, if you talk about the Windows Phone app, it's a single app page. Doesn't provide much. Then we have the data-bound application. This is a complete end-to-end application, which comes with a data model, a view model, and a view. How many of you are familiar with the MVVM pattern? Quite a few. MVC? Okay. So MVVM is very much similar to MVC, right? It stands for model view model. So you have a model, your database, and an intermediary entity called the view model, which maps between the view and the model. So you do not take code and tie it directly to the data. You have an intermediary called the view model, which is responsible of providing content to the view. And we'll look at those also as we go along. Then you have the pivot application. If you remember the previous screen where we had the pivot of the recipes, so it's a multi-page kind of control which allows you to pan from left to right on different views. And then you have the panorama. Panorama is like a huge view, allows you to scroll. Many of the application hubs that you see in Windows Phone use the panorama style interface. So if you see here, you have the single page, you have the pivot control and the panorama style. So we're going to start building this Contoso cookbook, right? And if you see here, we're going to start with the recipe page. Rather than starting with the list of the regions, we'll start with the recipe page. And when you start building application, keep in mind that each page needs to be standalone, right? Because that's how the pages even in execution are. They are standalone, they are stateless. So when you design your application, design the pages, let them be independent of each other. So here I have a pivot control, right? And a page with details about the region, right? Details about the recipe, and then I have the ingredients. So the way I design that is in XAML. I have the phone of the root frame, I call it, which is this whole page. In that I have something called the pivot control. And the pivot control has the headers, which provides the navigation. And then you have the individual pages or items controls. So in here I have the item 1 header and I have the item 2 header. There are two pivot items and I can move back and forth between the two. When you design in XAML, right, think of it as HTML. It's very verbose. It declares the objects that you want to instantiate, right? So it's another way of instantiating objects in code. So you either do it in XAML or you do it in the code behind, right? At the end, you are instantiating an object. You have a name associated with the object that you can reference in your code behind. And these objects lie in the system.windows.controls namespace. So if you look at the page, I have a pivot title, I have the headers, I have an image, text block, various text blocks in the. So these controls now make up my page. Then each element, right, each element that I see here has properties that I can define either in the XAML itself or through code behind at runtime. So I have the screen position, I have the height and width, I have the font color, the size. So when I use them in XAML, I get design visibility. When I do it at code behind, I get the visibility at runtime. And then you have a hierarchy of these objects. So they all inherit from the framework element. And then you have text box, you have controls, then content control, button base, and then you have button, you have a radio button. So you have a hierarchy of objects that you can use. And you can build your own. So it's very easy to take a particular control and create your own class based on that control. So if you see here, we had the image, it has a name, and it has a property which is uniform fill. It shows how you're going to fill that image in the container. You have a scroll viewer, which allows you to scroll text within the page, because definitely you are not going to fit the whole content in the page itself. You need to be able to scroll the page, and that's what the scroll viewer does, right? And then you have a stack panel, which allows you to stack child elements inside the control. And in here we have two items called prep time and the value of that prep time in a horizontal block. So if you see here, if you go back, we had the stack panel here, horizontally laid out. You have the text prep time and the actual value of the preparation time, right? And then we have what we call as container controls. So if you see here the grid is a container control. The stack panel is a container control, right? The image is a container. You can put content into these controls. So if you see here, I have a grid which has 2 rows, and I have all this content sitting within the grid. If you see the stack panel, I have 2 text blocks sitting inside the grid, stack panel. What you can do with the grid is you can design a table, right? You can have various rows and columns in your grid. In our case, we have 3 rows, and since we do not have a definition for a column, by default we have 1 column, right? But you can define more if you like. In here we have something called fixed width, which is 240. And then you have something called star, which means that give me the real estate which is left over. So it will fill up the rest of the real estate. Clear? So think about it this way. I have a grid with 3 rows. I want the first one to be 1/3. The second one to be 2/3. So what I could do is, on the first row I'll say 1 star, and the second column, on the second row I will say 2 star. So that is going to define it as 1/3, 2/3, and then I can put the last one as star. That's going to give me the rest of the space. Clear? Now, in terms of alignment, the phone controls should be aligned at 12 pixels. To give the best representation of your UI. You could have it at 16 or 18 pixels also, but the recommendation is have them aligned at 12 pixels, because that's how most of the screen controls are. If you want to put a gap between controls, then let it be 12 pixels also. So if you see here, the aligned is not proper, right? The image is protruding to the left of the content. It's not well aligned, and it does not give a very crisp representation of your UI. There's no spacing between the elements. It's all cluttered together. So keep this in mind when you're designing your applications. They need to be well spaced out, clearly visible, and well aligned. Now, what we do in terms of design for the developers and the designers, we provide a grid layout, right? So you can align your controls in that grid. So if you see Visual Studio, you have a button in between which allows you to align the UI to the grid. And it's also available in Blend. We have also incorporated in Visual Studio with the new release. What we also do is provide you an alignment grid picture that you can uncomment and be shown at runtime, so you can ensure that your UI is well aligned. Clear? And this is available on the main page.xaml. You can take this and you can paste it into the other controls if you like, and you need to uncomment it at the end of the page. So it sort of overlaps and provides you the UI. So if you see here, this is the grid image, and it shows you that your UI is well aligned to the grid. Clear? And then we can use the margin property to provide proper margins to the controls. So if you see here, this image, right, is at a margin of 12. Usually the content on the left would be 24 pixels, but the reason this is 12 because the pivot control by itself has a spacing of 12, right? So when you provide another 12, then you get that spacing of 24. So let me show you a demo. Say new, sorry, wrong place. So you come here and say file, new, project. And if you remember, we were creating the recipe detail page, right? Which is a pivot control. So I can come in here and say Visual C# and Windows Phone, and we'll name the project Contoso Cookbook. And I will take the Windows Phone application to start with. Now, since my first page on the application is a list, I could use the single page template to start with, right? Because I just need to put a list of items in here. What I want to do next is come in here and say add new item, so I will take a portrait page and we will call it recipe. And in here, so what you can do is I can get rid of all of this and bring the pivot control in here. And in here, I can have the pivot dot from here. So if you see here, we have the pivot control, and then we have something called the pivot items. And this is what is going to provide me the different pages that I have. And I can add several of these pivot items, right? And each is going to give me a page. So let's open one that has already been created and let's walk through that. So in here, I have the main page, and I have the recipe detail page. This is the page we were trying to design. So in here I have the pivot control. I have given it a name called Conducer Cookbook, and then I have the different headers. So I have two sections, one called the recipe, the other called ingredients. So let me run this. So I have the recipe page, I have the recipe control, and then if I pan it, I get the ingredients. So I have one control which gives me various pages, and in each of that section, each item, I can add controls as I like that is going to make up that page. Okay? And I can have as many sections as I want. Let's comment this also out. So if you see here in the pivot item, I have a grid with 4 rows, right? And a single column, and in each of this I have put the text block for the recipe name, the image, and then I put a scroll viewer for scrolling the content of the recipe, right? And then I have a stack panel which provides me the prep time and the actual prep time, right? Now if you see here, I am providing the actual row in which I want to put the content. So if you see here, this goes in row number 2, which is actually row number 3 because the grid starts with row 0. You have got row 0, got row 1, and then row 2, which is corresponding to the 3rd row. And then you have the 3rd row, which corresponds to the 4th row. Clear? So let's talk about styles and themes. Now what I have done here is I have a scroll viewer in which I have put the text, and I'm putting it as white foreground and font size of 12. Similarly, I have the second one which is white, foreground is light gray, and font size is 24. Can tell me something, anybody, what is wrong with this? Come again? I'm hard coding. What else? From a design perspective, what is wrong? Come again?
It will not follow the. It doesn't match a parenthesis line.
I didn't hear you.
This will be doesn't mention parenthesis line.
So it does not incorporate the styles that are there in the system styles. Yes.
Foreground for the scroll and the foreground.
Yes.
The white.
Yes, white.
Color.
Yes. So the background is black, so the foreground is white is okay. The biggest problem with this, the biggest problem with this is if the user changes to a light theme, the text is going to disappear because white on white will become blank, right? So and this is the first thing, and this is one of the top 5 reasons why your applications fail. So when you submit your application for testing, the first thing they would do is change the theme. They will take it from a light theme to a dark theme or dark theme to a light theme. And if it does not show the UI properly, your application fails. Okay? So if you see here, I change the theme and see what happens to your application. It's totally useless, right? So you should not have a dependency on hard-coded values. The best way to do this is use the system styles that are provided with the SDK, right? So these styles have been designed so that when you change the theme, they incorporate the change and they will reflect the correct color. So if it's a light theme, you'll have a dark color. If it's a dark theme, then you'll have a light color. So always use the styles that are provided to you in the resource kit. We had this in Blend, so you could use the inbuilt styles from Blend, and the same thing has been provided to you in Visual Studio also. So you can go and look at the styles that are there and apply those styles to your elements. So I'll quickly show you how that is done. Let's open the designer. A couple of things I would like to point out here since we are in the designer. If you see, I have a tab called device on the left hand side. If I click on it, it gives me different resolutions that I can design my application in. Right? So right now I have 480 by 800, this is WVGA. I have WXGA support, and then I have 720 by 120, 720 by 1280 support. So I can, even at design time, look at how the controls are going to behave using these formats. Then I can set that theme. I can say I want a light theme or I want a dark theme, and I can see how the controls are going to behave, right? Then I have something called the document outline. And the document outline allows me to easily navigate between the framework hierarchy. So I can look at the page hierarchy and I can navigate it up and down and then select, and it goes between code and the UI, it starts selecting them. So if I come here, right click, I can say edit style, and I say apply resource. And it brings me the resources that are there on the phone. So if you see now, this is hard coded, right? So if I right click, edit style, let's go here. And then I can take the let's take this for example. So now if you see, it has set the resource as the style that I selected. And if I run this, and I change my style, so I go to settings, and I take a light theme. And this one is it renders well. Okay. So let's talk about design time data. So if you saw when I started creating the templates, I did not get visual representation of data that I was binding the controls to, right? Most important when you're designing controls is to see how they are going to be laid out on the screen. So empty boxes usually do not give us a good representation. I need to have content in it. And for that, we have provided you the tools in Blend which allow you to create design time data. So in Blend, what you could do is, if you have a data model, if you have classes that depict your data, Blend can take that and create sample data. It will generate an XML document for the data that you can edit. You can go and it also creates a whole data model for you. So if you use the data bound application, right, the template, the data bound template, you get the sample data, the data model class, everything from the templates itself. Or you can go into Blend and create your own template using the data generation tool. Now, you can create your sample data using expressions. You can create your, you can edit your data. You can even specify criteria how you want your data to be generated. So if you see here, I said I want a maximum word count of 4, maximum word length of 8. What are the items that I want in the data model? And then it generates this schema for me, which represents my data. So we'll come back to this just so that we don't go back and forth. Let's talk about data binding. So as we all said in the previous slide, fundamental problem with having code in your UI is it's hard coded, right? It's not easy to test, it's not easy to change. Even for very trivial applications, when you get into modifying those applications, it becomes very difficult. Let's say I have 2 pages or 3 pages which have controls bound to the same data, right? And I want to change that data. Then I have to go into all those pages and start removing the content and adding content. If I had bound that to a view model, then the view model is responsible of putting content to the controls. Any changes that I make to the view model are automatically going to be reflected in the controls, right? So with that, we provide different ways of binding data to the view model. So in here you have a text block, and the name of the text block is directions text block. And I have the text property of the text block bound to something called directions. Now what this means is, I have a property called directions which is bound to this control. So I have an object which has a property called directions. Now what that object is, we are not specifying here. It could be any object, as long as it has a property called directions. Clear? So I am binding that to the text block. What I can then do is bind the object to a root element like the grid or the page by using the data context property. If it's a list box, it's a collection, then I will use the items source property. So now I have an object that I can either populate at runtime or at design time, and then each element is going to be bound to a property of that object. Clear? And then I have various ways of bringing in this data. So let's say you are bringing in data which does not change, right? So you do not want to have the overhead of a mechanism which is going to monitor changes in your data. So you just identify to the text block that this is a one-time data. The text block is going to go to the data source, bring back the data once at startup, and then it's not going to monitor it again. So this is one-way data binding. Then, that is called one-time data binding. One-way data binding is when the control just looks for data to come in. So whenever the data changes in the back end, it's going to refresh the data. You have something called the two-way data binding. The two-way data binding, the control looks for changes in the data set, refreshes the UI, and then whenever you update the control, the data is sent back to the data set. Clear? In order to implement that, you have to implement the iNotify property changed interface in your view model. What that does it has this event that is going to be raised whenever the property changes. So think about this. Each framework element would monitor for this event. Whenever there is a change in the property, this event is raised, and then the UI is going to refresh itself with the new content. So if you see here, I have a property called ID. In it, in the setter, whenever the property changes, I am raising the event and I'm passing it the property name. Right? Now, can somebody tell me what is the problem with this kind of an interface? We are hard coding the ID, the name of the property. So if tomorrow I go into Visual Studio and refactor this ID to be called my ID, what happens to this string? It remains ID. So my data binding is broken. So what the team has done in the new version is they have something called the column member name. And you denote that in your property. So if you see here, I have the same property and I'm here saying this dot ID. That means this is my property name and I have declared this property with the column member name. So what happens now is, instead of me having to pass that ID or a string, right, it's going to take the name of the property and automatically bind it to the interface. Right? So this is a much cleaner way of implementing notify property changed. Then if you remember, we said that when you're binding to list box, you bind to the items source property. So in here I'm binding the item source property to a list of ingredients. So it's a collection. Alright? So think about it this way. I have an element which is going to monitor changes in the property. So if my name changes, I want that name to be updated. But what happens if in that list I add another name, another person object? What happens? That collection is not going to be notified. It's just the individual elements that are going to be notified. The collection is not notified. So in that case, you use something called the observable collection. And this monitors changes in the addition and deletion and changes of these elements. So if you add a new record, you delete a record, it's going to reflect in your UI. So I have an item, view items property which is implementing an observable collection of the item view model, and I am adding these to the collection, and then I just bind that to the item source property. When you're building applications, try to use the MVVM model, because that's what's going to give you separation of concerns. You're going to have a separate view model, you're going to have a separate view, and you have a separate model. And I'll show it to you in a while. And it's well documented on the MSDN page, and you can go to Galasoft. This is the creator of the MVVM pattern, and you have various flavors of this. You have MVVM, you have MVVM Lite that you can use in your applications. So as I mentioned in the morning, there are no more list boxes. We've got rid of them. What you have now is the long list selector, and this is like the list on steroids. So it provides you a lot of more capabilities. It is more performant than the list box. So in this, you get the jump list, the group list with headers. You get the grouping of the list itself. And this was a control that was there in the Silverlight toolkit previously. It's been moved to the toolbox. And for performance reasons, it's been moved to the ROM, right? So you don't have to install the control. It's there on the phone itself. It doesn't come shipped with your code. Now, when you start binding data to your list box controls, The list box control or the long list does not have the capability of rendering your UI. Okay, so the best you would get is this, which is kind of toString of your class name. So if you see here, I am binding this to the item groups property in the view model. But what I am getting in the UI is just a string representation of the class name. So what you can do is, you can go to Blend and you can drag drop that item into the page. And what the Blend UI will do is it will create the right UI for you. So if it's, for example, a control with items in it, it's going to create a list box. Now, it's going to actually create a list box, not a long list. And this is one place that the team has missed. I don't know if they have updated in the RTM version, but in the developer preview, it was still the list box, right? You can just go and change it from the list box to the long list and it works fine, because the list box is no longer available in the toolbox. And I will demo this to you in a while. And then you have templates which allow you to design the UI. So if you see here, I have the list, and then I can edit the item template. And then it allows me to provide content to the list box which makes up of individual elements, right? So if you see here, I have a data template which is made up of a grid, 2 columns and 2 rows. Let me show you what we have covered. And let me open this in Blend. So if you see here, I have a data tab on the right. See here, I have a data tab. And this is going to bring in any of the classes that have been defined in my project. So I have a class called recipe data. And what I can do with that is I can come in and say create sample data from class. And it's going to look at my code and ask me to pick up a class that is going to provide the recipe information. So I can come in here, okay, pick up the class. So in this, and click OK. And what this does is it creates a new sample data for me, right? So let me close this, or let's not save this, go back to Visual Studio. And in here I have something called the data model, in which I had defined my recipe data source that I was using. And in the data folder is going to create is this the one? No, this is the class. in the sample data, it creates me the sample data. So if you see here, this is the data that has been created by Blend. And I have complete control on how this data is created. So what I could also do is in the UI, I can come in and say drop the items group on the surface. So I don't know if you can see this. You see the pop-up box? What does it say? It says create a list box and bind its item source property to items group. Right? So when I do that, it's actually creating a template for me. It's just not binding the data source, it's creating a template for me. Clear? Okay, let's go back one step. Let's go to the code. And in here, let's remove this grid control, okay? And then I'm going to take this and I'm going to drop it in here. So if you see the layout now, I did not. Okay, let's try it again. Interesting. Okay. So if you see here, it's created a data template for me in which it has added the stack panel and the items that were there in my class. So it has added all of those. Now I can go in Blend and I can start designing this the way I like it. So it's already created this data template for me. Clear? And this is one of the benefits of using the Blend design tool because it provides you more control on the UI than Visual Studio would have done. If I had to do the same thing with Visual Studio, it would have just added the list box control without this data template, right? Let's close this. So if I create a new project, and in this, I'm going to create a data bound application, and click OK. Let me run this application. So if you see here, I have a list. I can scroll through the list. I can select an item. It takes me to a detail page, right? Let's go back to settings. So in here I have two pages, the main page which has the list box control and the detail page. If you see here, I have got the view models. So I have two view models, one called the main view model and the item view model. So if you use this template, you get that MVVM kind of a framework out of the box. It provides you the capability out of the box. And then I have the sample data, which is providing me the data. right? And then I have the data generated from the, so this becomes my model. This is generated from Blend, right? And I have the view models, and then I have the different views. And if you see this in code, I am mapping the data context to the view model, right? So I have the view and I have the view model, and in code I am mapping the two. What also I get with this kind of a scenario is design time data, right? So if you look at the namespace here, I have something called d:\data context. And what this means that this is a design time data. So I am saying this is design data and this is where the data resides. So this is not runtime data, this is design time data. And this helps me in designing the UI much better, because now I can see content. It's just not a text box, not just a radio button. It's something more meaningful for me. I can look at the items, I can look at the pictures, and I can see up front what my UI is going to behave like, okay? So what we saw in this session was how we start with a piece of paper, designing the application, right? Thinking about the overall architecture of the application, how the application is going to behave, what is the navigation that the application is going to perform, what are the pages, what are the elements that are going to go in there, right? We also talked about the principles of designing Windows Phone 8 applications. We saw how the tools provide you sample data, design time data, how you can use the tools to better design your applications, how you can use the themes and the resource and the styles that are provided by the templates to make sure that your applications behave properly when in the different themes, and the light theme or the dark theme. So we're going to continue this discussion in the next topic, where we talk in more detail about the design elements, the navigation, and how you move from one page to the other, etc. So what we could do now is take a short break. We leave. Any questions on this section? Yes, go ahead.
What about the backend database? Because we can store in the local storage, and there is special, we can use the other databases like.
So the question is, what about the local? What about the database? How do I bind data? So in Windows Phone 7.5, you had the capability of bringing your local DB, which is something that you get out of Visual Studio, into the Windows Phone application. With Windows Phone 8, you can still bring the local DB, or you can bring the SQLite database. So if you are having applications on different platforms, you're already using SQLite, then you can bring the same SQLite database to the phone. If you want a backend database, something more dynamic, then use services, right? And this is the talk we will do next month, how you bring in your backend data to the mobile devices, okay?
Next month or the next session?
Next month. It's a whole topic about building applications which are cross-platform, how to leverage the Azure mobile services to bring data not only to Windows Phone 8, but to Windows 8 and your Apple devices, okay? Because that's a whole subject by itself. Anything else? Yes?
Regarding the caller member name attribute, is it available at the database or it's a Silverlight 5 feature only?
Come again, I did not get you well.
The attributes called the caller member name attribute.
The caller member name. I think it is a feature of the it's not just for phone. I'm not sure if it's for phone only or it's part of Visual Studio, but I can check and I can tell you. Okay? Yes?
Could we use tools like exit framework here and link to this tool?
So you can use Entity Framework on the server side, right? You cannot use Entity Framework on the client because
Via service, can we use
Yeah, you can use it via services. So you can call services on your phone and get data. So that's why I said you can use it on your backend server, right? You can have the services running, and then you call the services from your client. Yes. Yes.
What about portable class?
What about?
Portable class technology.
Portable class technology, and that's what we are going to talk about next month. Okay, next month, where you build applications that are going to run on Windows 8, Windows Phone 8. So you want to have the portable class library kind of a template in place, right? So inshallah, we'll talk about that next month.
We have a concept of Windows services, right? Do we have a similar concept in this?
As a service?
Yeah, actually, so let's say, for example, I want to do some job in...
So you have something called background tasks in Windows Phone. And you can spawn off those tasks, and your tasks are going to run in the background.
So it is similar to Windows services?
It is not similar to Windows services, because in Windows services you can create a service by itself without an application, right? The background task is attached to an application. So when you start an application, you start the background task, and that sort of correlates with your application. But it is going to continue in the background even when your application shuts down.
What if the application shuts down? I mean, like, I don't want to start the application. The Windows, the service should start.
So the services have a different, and you should not be mixing services with background tasks, because background tasks, like for example, they would run probably in half an hour, an hour's time. It's not like a service which is continuously running and providing you capability. Right? Like for example, you have the print spooler service. It's continuously running and servicing. It's not going to wait for half an hour, 1 hour to come back to your application code. Right? So background tasks are a bit different than services. You don't have the concept of services here. The reason you don't have that is these consume a lot of power. So you want to conserve your battery as much as possible. So we will talk about that later in the day when you talk about the application lifecycle management. When your application moves off, it is shut down. Okay? But you still have capabilities like voice over IP, location tracking, which allows you to let the application run in the background. But then again, it's not similar to what you mean by services.